It's not just good enough to build a great building material. We also need to build it in a sustainable long-term way. And that's where the new wave of development of concrete is happening at the moment. And it's amazing to be part of that change in this building material.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.
Greetings and welcome along to the New Zealand Tech Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Spain, and for this episode, we are joined by Zarina Alexander, who is the co-founder and chief executive of Neocrete. Welcome along. How are you, Zarina?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. It's not that often that we do get a chance to sit down with a founder from, I guess, a deep tech company, which is really where Neocrete sits. So really looking forward to sort of delving into that once we've kind of covered off the tech news of the day and the week. But maybe you can give listeners just a little overview of, where you fit into this big wide world of tech and innovation.
Yeah, sure. Well, when we think about deep tech, we don't normally think about materials technology. It's usually like this high tech, like all the other devices.
Yeah.
And we're developing new materials and new building material, and the amazing building material, which is concrete, that we actually see everywhere, and it's the most used product on the planet after water, and we're just making it better. So we are a New Zealand-based company that has global aspirations, and we're developing low carbon, low cost, and high performing cement replacements. And just quickly, why we're doing it and how. So why we're doing it is because the main ingredient of concrete is cement, and it's very, very carbon intensive to produce. And we produce around 4 billion tons of cement every year. And for each ton of cement produced, we release 1 ton of CO2 roughly. So it's a huge problem that we're trying to solve. And so that's why we're focused on that. So we're replacing cement with low carbon alternatives. And how we're doing it, so to make cement, you need to source materials, and then you need to highly process them. You need to heat them up and grind them, and there are all sorts of big capital and industrial processes that require fossil fuels usually and energy, and as a result, you produce a lot of CO2. So what we do, we take low process, mainly natural materials of usually volcanic nature or some waste materials, and we add our technology, which is Neocrete Activator. It's 2 to 3% of those materials, and we create similar chemical reactions, similar properties to cement, but without the need for this bulky, costly, and carbon-intensive infrastructure.
Oh, that's really cool. Well, looking forward to sort of delving in and hearing more of the story. Before we get started, of course, a big thank you to our show partners, to 1NZ, 2 Degrees, Spark, HP and Gorilla Technology. Really appreciate their support of the New Zealand Tech Podcast and of the broader tech and innovation ecosystems in New Zealand. Well, let's delve into the New Zealand news to start with. Top of the list, the government advising that they're exploring options on a social media ban for under 16s. And we've also sort of seen, a lobby group kind of, start up as well locally, and including some pretty well-known folks, including people that have been here in the studio in the past, who are really pushing for this idea of a media ban for under 16s. What's your thought on this? Because social media causes a lot of harm, right? And probably the most vulnerable tend to be those that are struggling in some way, or those that are younger. So, do you think this makes sense?
Yes, I'm probably mainly for that idea, and for the reason that we need to protect our kids while they are still developing. And I think what it creates is like they can't separate the reality from social media reality, which is a completely different kind of fake imaginary world. And it's okay to read fairy tales to a 3-year-old, but then as they grow and they continue living in this imaginary world, I think it's not healthy. And I'm usually against all sorts of blanket bans, but maybe there needs to be some rules and regulations, because those social media platforms, they probably won't do it for themselves, because privately owned companies, driven by profits and all sorts of different things. So I think that's where the government can step in and help and protect the society.
Yeah, yeah. And look, I think there's some wisdom there, and look, we need to protect our youngsters, and I agree with that, and I agree that when we look at our social media companies, despite what they say, I think it's fair to say that they're largely driven by profit, and so if we were to drill into any of the social media companies, you can see a lot of harm that's been caused. I've probably spoken more about Meta than any others. We've had their staff here in the studio for private conversations. I've put some hard questions to them, around things that are around protecting our youngsters. And, interestingly, really all they seemed interested in was promoting their latest sort of things, and they didn't come back to me on some of the harm questions and so on that I put to them. So I think we've definitely got a big challenge. I guess with putting a ban across on a blanket basis, I think there probably are some challenges, and maybe this is hence why the government is saying, look, we're here to explore the options, rather than, hey, we're immediately following in Australia's footsteps, who have put in legislation for their ban, which kicks off, I don't know, if later this year or early next year. So that's coming. There have been American states that have gone down some of these sorts of tracks where they've put some particular bans in place that require some form of age verification. Yeah, I guess the things that kind of come to mind for me is, how do you enforce that? So if you're age verifying, that means you're age verifying everybody, and you either do that in a kind of a weak manner, which then becomes very easy for someone to kind of get around it. So then what's the point of having it in the first place? Or you have something that's really, really strong, and every single person then who's online is going to have their, I guess, effectively has their full identity linked back to their online profile, which I think in a lot of cases is probably fine. But I think sometimes there are some benefits of having some anonymity online as well. So you end up probably with some challenges there.
Yeah, well, I don't think there'll be a problem for technology companies to identify who is below legal age for certain websites. They know so much information about us now. They know potentially the areas where we live. There are only 3 data points that you really need to clearly identify an individual. So I don't think if they really put their minds into it, there wouldn't be a problem identifying who those people are. Then, and on the other hand, I think if a teenager finds a technological way to go around those bans, so maybe they're not that underage, maybe they're they're already ready to enter the world, because we're always, finding the ways to an extent around some bans as teenagers. We're pushing the boundaries and stuff. So of course there will be some exceptions, and maybe there shouldn't be a blanket rule. It should be there just should be consequences for hurting teenagers, really. And the question should be, if you remove that social media, would that individual be hurt otherwise? And if the answer is no, then let's do something about it.
Mm-hmm. One of the other challenges is how you draw the lines. So what is and isn't social media? And this was part of the discussion with the Australian debate when it came up. Is YouTube social media? Is this something that's good and safe? And, does it fall into that sort of social media category? And I think many would say, well, yeah, it does. It's, especially, these days where, elements of it are a mirror for sort of TikTok and so on. So, and then, where do you draw the lines on the different platforms? Because you could largely argue that most things online, even games, have a social media element to them, right? So, a youngster gets on their favorite game, the likes of Roblox and things like this that are, very common out there. And then there's a chat element, there's this and there's that. So, it would be interesting in terms of how some of those lines could get drawn. But look, I think it is right that we as a country need to look at this, take these topics seriously. I'm not sure that we probably have done, brilliantly in the past in terms of pushing back, and probably, there's been probably way too much power in the hands of, the likes of Meta and, YouTube and, other, brands or entities. So, good to start that conversation, and let's see how it plays out. But I guess, my perspective is a complete blanket ban. There's probably some a bunch of downsides, and we touched on a couple of them.
I would just say, in terms of where do we draw the line, that's where technology can actually help us. So are you telling me that they can predict if I'm about to buy a house and send me all these adverts to look at this house and everything? So they can use that technology to actually predict if a person is struggling, or something is about to hurt the person, is or mentally unstable or anything. It's probably not beneficial for them to keep using that. So I think that's where technology can be very, very useful. And they say, look, if you see these signs, you work with psychologists, you work with all those teachers and parents and stuff. If you see these signs, highly likely there's correlation that something might happen, and that's where you enforce that ban.
Yeah, I like that perspective, actually, to put that responsibility, back onto these companies that know so much about us, yet they use that information for their own gain and generating increasing revenue. So, the social dilemma, I'll mention it again. We've mentioned it before. I'm picking it's probably still on Netflix as a good watch to understand kind of some of the realities of kind of what does go on inside these companies, and how in some ways of how they're motivated to really take our attention, and not always for good. I saw a blog post, I'm trying to remember who published it, but around the power outage that happened in Spain and Portugal recently, and I think it was roughly 24 hours of power outage, and how good it was because people were streaming out of their apartments, and there was all of this kind of spending time with people because there was no way to get online, and actually encouraged more sort of people interaction. And I imagine that the sort of deeper we go down the social media rabbit hole and living in a kind of online world, the more disconnected it's possible to get from others.
Yeah, even in our team, I see the younger people that work in the lab, during lunchtimes, we usually discuss stuff with my generation, and then you see them all on their phones, on their devices, and I'm like, oh, that's so much fun. I mean, they're playing New York Times games and everything, they're quite, and it's very interesting. It probably shows our age that we kind of judge them now on what we didn't have access to when we were younger.
Well, I think there's definitely some learnings, and I guess part of this comes back to the parenting side, right? So how much do we hand over and say, look, the state needs to figure this out, and how much do we say, hey, parents need to have some responsibility around where they draw the lines for youngsters, and of course that is going to vary from family to family in terms of, well, hey, we don't know how to manage some of these things, and so on through to, it's just easy when there are blanket rules put in place. And one of the blanket rules I guess we've had in New Zealand over the last period has been the banning of smartphones and in schools predominantly, and so that's been an interesting one to watch. But that's a pretty easy environment, because of the school structure and so on to do that. So you're effectively putting in a social media and then some ban during school hours. But I don't think there's been too much pushback on that one since it's come in. Doesn't mean it's absolutely the right thing to do, but I would pick probably that one's ended up okay. Now on to other topics. We've got a scenario where the Mayor of Auckland, Wayne Brown, is suggesting supercharging Auckland, and he's really looking to central government for some help to help drive economic growth, and amongst other areas, technology is part of that. So, he thinks that there needs to be a focus on immigration, tourism, housing, and technology. And he's really emphasising this, collaboration with central government to make Auckland a hub for innovation. And so, this is interesting to see. I don't think we have clarity on exactly where he's suggesting central government should be stepping in, but referring to the role of Auckland in New Zealand's economy, contributing a third of New Zealand's gross domestic product, and that we need to lean into these sort of high value sectors like tech, which to me makes some sense. He's talked about tech precincts and a mentioning of the Wynyard Quarter Tech Precinct, biotech hub at Victoria Park Market. He's talking about reduced red tape and regulatory reform, and often I guess these sort of government regulations can get in the way and make it a lot harder and slower to do business. I don't know how you've found that, whether that's been a challenge at all, or you've been operating in a world where that hasn't really impacted you a great deal.
Yeah, it hasn't really impacted us a great deal. If anything, there's like more around the regulations with continuous carbon emissions and not putting a tax on that. But we understand the current economic situation, probably not the best timing to impose that, like in Europe. So, but haven't been largely affected.
Another area that mentioned is investment in skills and talent development, which I think probably most of us are keen to see sort of continued investment on that front, and the opportunity to also attract global talent. I saw mention of support for infrastructure projects that help with connectivity. I actually think we're doing pretty well as far as connectivity in Auckland with fibre, that the government have already funded 5G networks, but of course there are limits and there are edges to where that current connectivity runs to, and then
it goes in line with that social media ban, right? Some areas probably just naturally will happen with no connectivity.
That's true. Yeah. Well, if you got no electricity, that one can work quite well, but not too many parts in New Zealand that are, or not so many that are like that these days. Yeah. Also, tax incentives around research and development and financial support. So we always know that the councils are kind of looking for that help from central government. So it'll be interesting to see whether this attracts much or any attention from central government. But I think it's encouraging to see, I guess, a mayor who wouldn't have picked as being a big technologist to be encouraging the direction of Auckland's growth in this way. So,
and it's great to see when politicians make long-term decisions, especially with the short cycles in New Zealand. There's so much motivation to actually just have some decision for short-term benefits, right?
Yes,
and then investing in deep technology and developing hubs and tax incentives. It's a long-term game. You will see benefits, but probably when he's not a mayor anymore, But he's like, okay, I think this is beneficial for New Zealand, whether I'm in or not. It's a right place to focus on, and we're definitely benefiting from RDTI, which is R&D tax incentives, and a lot of other resources available for startups.
Yeah.
And it's very, very helpful. And it definitely speeds up the research and development. It lets us hire more people. It lets us, focus more resources on R&D. And I welcome that initiative. But obviously, I'm biased.
Well, we've all got our different leanings, but I largely agree on that front too. And I think one of the things that we all see, but maybe don't think about as much as we should, is that lack of being strategic often in these investments, and the nature of the way that, whether it be business leaders or politicians, there is often an incentive to focus on the short term rather than the long term. And we often see that with firms that are disrupted, where the leadership are being incentivized on what they get the next quarter, not on laying the tracks and laying the foundations and doing things that are going to, make a real difference over a long term as well. Also in the news, warnings around this was from recent weather events and flooding and bits and pieces, which we've had, I guess, on a smaller scale than what we saw 2013, but that these things are often a facilitator of then sort of fake alerts and scams and things like that, trying to either harvest information from people or whatnot, varying phishing scams and so on. So just a reminder to keep educating ourselves, educating our families, our colleagues, and so on around these risks that come up. And I guess one of the challenges is those messages that often have a kind of a fake urgency to them. So interestingly, one of the things that my firm does, with clients is as part of the cybersecurity regime, we do phishing tests, and so we send out, whether it's an email or what have you, to see whether you can kind of trick staff into clicking on that, and if you do, then hey, they might need a little bit more education on these types of scams. And one organisation that we've been working with recently, it was quite interesting because we've done some education with them, but a comment came back from one of the staff, who's quite new on board because they're a new organisation. They'd never encountered that in any organisation they worked for before. So just a reminder, we need to keep at these things and not assume, because a lot of organisations have been doing these things for some time, that everybody's up to the play and so on. So.
And those scams are getting more and more sophisticated. I've heard of the one, not in New Zealand, where they send you a fake speeding fine that you have to pay. Like, who would have thought of that?
Oh,
I would never even check.
Yeah.
So not that I want to give ideas out there, but they're getting more and more sophisticated. So
the next topic, we're seeing license plate recognition being used sort of more and more for parking enforcement. So around Auckland, there are a lot of vehicles that are driving around. I had a close look at one of these vehicles the other day that was parked, and it kind of looks a little bit like some of the autonomous vehicles from Waymo and the like, because of all these cameras around the vehicle. I see that Hutt City Council has recently implemented license plate recognition to improve their sort of parking enforcement. So we're collecting, I guess, more and more data from all sorts of different cameras and sources, but we don't, unfortunately, have that guarantee that the data that's collected ends up sort of getting or staying safe and secure. And I guess, you link together a few bits and pieces of data, and you could completely, fake those speeding fines if you've got data on where people are driving, and you were able to link that together with some of this data, which I'm not saying is necessarily the case within New Zealand, but the more and more data that's out there, we get increased challenges with it as well, don't we?
Yeah, and it's much harder for us to collect information on them, because what we used to do early ages of Neocrete is really hard to find free or cheap parking in Parnell, where our labs are in the outside building.
Yes.
And we'd have a summer intern who'd analyze the time when we get the fines to know the routine of the parking warden.
Yeah.
And okay, he's there from this time to this time, so highly likely you're going to get a fine. But outside of these hours, so we did statistical analysis on them.
That's
and
impressive.
all of a sudden they changed it. And I'm like, how do I get a fine on my mail when there's no tickets anymore? They just
because it's all computerized.
Yeah, computerized.
Right?
I'm like, all this database we've built over the last few years is useless now.
And I think there's the two sides, to that. On one side, it's like, well, okay, if we're not supposed to park in a particular area, but there are real challenges in some areas and some buildings, and as you say, in your area in Parnell, I always have a challenge parking around there, and it's like, well, what does that encourage you to do? Park for a little bit too long, catch an Uber, catch a bus, ride a bike. Probably those last two, not so much for me. But yeah, it's a genuine challenge. And then if you're gonna get fined or you can't park for very long, I don't know what the perfect solutions are. And then I guess the council in Auckland aren't necessarily supporting that because they've sold their big parking building, downtown. So I have no idea what that actually looks like for Auckland. Once that's for Auckland sort of CBD and waterfront area, once that's gone, we don't seem to be getting the perfect balance on these things.
Yeah,
So,
and you'd think with that technology now, you probably would need to hire less parking wardens, pay less salaries, just you fit out your couple of cars and everything.
Yeah.
And you'd think the parking fines would go lower because their costs go down. But no, they went up a couple of times. They went up already.
I haven't had one for
They don't
a
even need to
while.
get out of the car anymore. It's still going up.
Yeah,
'Cause
I
then it creates
think that can be a pretty emotive topic. It is a genuine challenge how we get these things right, and I do think there are some areas we've gone too far in one direction or another, and when you've kind of cut out lanes and you've slowed speeds down, that could be a challenge from a productivity perspective and have a flow on. And some would say, well, just work from home, but I think there's a lot to be said for being face to face, right? So
Absolutely.
On to just a few international topics. It was interesting reading around. It's a pretty sad situation in the US where a chap was murdered, effectively a road rage victim. And ultimately, the killer had been convicted, but the family, I guess, were wondering what their options were to reflect sort of the impact of this death. And what they did was they created an AI video of their family member who had passed away. They were able to kind of share a virtual victim impact statement, which is available online. So we might link to that for those who are kind of curious, like, wow, what does that look like? Obviously, this has been AI created, so it's not going to be a perfect reflection, but it was, I guess, drawing from what one of the family members felt might be appropriate. Yeah, quite an unusual situation, but it does, make you wonder what this might look like in the future, and if that was allowed to be sort of shown to the judge in this case as a victim, impact statement, and shown in court, will we see this type of thing expand where AI can put together bits and pieces and witnesses that have passed away or what have you cheering in court? I don't know. Do you think there should be some limits to this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's like how much of it is factual and how much of it is, it's like from other people's memories of that person. Because how accurate would that be if you go to a funeral or memorial? No one ever says anything that is like everyone only says nice things about the deceased, right? So
not always. I was at a funeral recently.
Most of the time, I mean, if you're mainly a nice person, you probably wouldn't bring it out. So it's not necessarily an accurate picture of that person, of the deceased, right?
Yeah,
so then that will impact the way, and if we start using it as an evidence. Oh, that's a very dangerous.
Yeah.
Very
I think that would seem too far to go, but it'll be an interesting area to watch. Just where and how far kind of AI gets into society, because there are really good use cases. There are other use cases that are a little bit blurry, and other ones I would say definitely not. So,
as a memory, and there was this idea where when you pass away, someone goes on cemetery and then they scan a QR code to find information about the deceased, and that would be cool as a memory. So you're you relive a certain moment of their life, and then you just understand what they were like to an extent. That
so how far should you go in that case? Okay, to have an interaction with them, have a talk with them, and you get a video character version of them?
That sounds like a Black Mirror episode. I don't know if you watched that on Netflix. Oh, that would be, I don't know, that would be amazing. I think all of us have some people that we'd love to interact with. But again, it becomes an imaginary world, and yeah, what part is a reality? And I'd like to live in a reality, however painful it is. And yeah, but would be, it's like videos, right? We watch videos, but that's facts. Yeah, it's a very
or
interesting,
entertainment. Yeah,
very
yeah.
interesting question because you're not really talking to that person anymore. So I probably wouldn't want that option, but some people would. So it's good to have. It's good to have that technology developing it to the next level. And
Yeah, we certainly have an interesting, future ahead as these sort of things as the limits sort of get pushed in differing directions. But yeah, it's important to recognise that just because we can do it doesn't mean that we necessarily should. Now, other interesting news is that Google are having to pay a fine to Texas, to the state there, equivalent of around 2.4 billion New Zealand dollars. Now, this relates to settling allegations of them unlawfully, tracking and collecting users' private data, and that's a significant win against Google. Also in the US, well, also actually in Texas, that Google had a previous settlement, I think, that came in around half that, so about 1.2 billion in New Zealand currency. And then we've got Apple, who are making payments to US citizens. So this has sort of been picked up by US media, specific to US citizens that can make a claim. There's a US $95 million settlement, which is probably in the direction of 160 million New Zealand dollars. And this is in relation to allegations that Siri recorded users' private conversations without consent, and people can go and then make these claims against Apple. I guess what I see here is these fines that are really stacking up, and we look at some of the fines from EU and other places. In this case, we're just talking one state, which accounts for maybe 8 to 9% of the US population. So if you were to sort of extrapolate out that roughly 3.6 billion that Google paying to Texas, and you said, well, what if there were equivalent laws and they had to pay equivalent fines across all the states of the US? Then that would go from 3.6 billion to roughly 40 billion. And then if that was extrapolated out to New Zealand and the rest of the world, if our laws matched up, then you'd be well north of 100 billion. So it does make me wonder a little bit around some of the laws that we have in New Zealand around data privacy, especially, and around these big, huge companies, and the fact that they're held to account in, say, Texas, but in New Zealand, we just kind of get kicked around. They can do whatever they like. We don't have any laws that really have any significant impact on an organisation of that sort of size. And yeah, I am curious around the approach that, say, EU and the EU takes, and other parts of the world where the fines are either just really big, full stop, or they're set maybe as a percentage of what that company turns over. And yeah, it does make me wonder what could or should we do as New Zealand. And maybe it's nothing, but maybe this is an area where we could step it up a little bit. And of course, there is a flip side, because if you make it too hard and too difficult, then these companies will turn off their services in New Zealand, which in some cases might not be a bad thing, but in other cases would leave us out in the cold a bit. Well, what do you think?
Well, I think with technology and any new developments and innovation, it pushes the boundaries into the unknown territories, and then the regulation catches up. And I think that's what's happening now. The regulation is catching up on a lot of those things, and now they're thinking about regulations around AI as well to catch up. And I absolutely think we need to think it through, and there needs to be a lot more transparency from those companies. It's not that they shouldn't be recording or shouldn't collecting information, but there needs to be consent, and there needs to be transparency of what they're collecting and who and what organizations they're sharing our information with and for what purposes. Because I believe that it's still most of the time done legally. You'd want to think that.
Yes,
and most of the time for good reasons, like programmatic advertising, for example, is like, I don't want to see the advertisements of beer, for example, but like a nice reasoning why not, so that's nice. It's good to have like very good purpose of or like watching favorite shows, like recommended new shows. So like all those like naive little things are very handy to have with technology, but as long as I know that's what they are collected for. And then as long as it becomes illegal, and I think the main thing that you said, it was unlawfully collecting information.
Yeah.
So we definitely need something that would say this where you draw the line of what you can do with that information. And as you said, New Zealand probably could do way more around that. And I definitely support that.
Yeah, and look, it's all very well saying they broke the law in New Zealand, but if, we slap them with a wet bus ticket, then, we don't really send any sort of message. And also, I mean, a lot of these companies are taking a lot of profit out of New Zealand. There's not actually, in many cases, any easy ways to tax them. And when we put in place, we're going to put a X% tax on something, that just goes on to, consumers and businesses locally anyway. So I am curious, is there another variation on this? It's sort of some sort of tax, but that might have a negative impact on innovation as well. So there does need to be
so
caution.
Here's a startup idea for you. How about we get a startup that would collect information on the companies that do that and say, hey, and make it transparent and release that information and say, look, if you're on Google, that's what's happening. And if you're on Meta, that's what's happening and stuff. So, and that's, I think public will find a lot of value in that and knowing what your information is like gathered for and what it's like shared with.
Yeah.
And then, so we can get value from that. And I think the public will then eventually, regulate itself and saying like, I don't like this. I'm going to be using less of Google and more of this service.
Yeah, we probably don't do enough, comparison on those fronts. All right, well, enough of sort of the broader, international local tech news. Time to drill in super local into Neocrete. Really keen to hear, a little bit of the story. How did the company get started, and how did you end up doing this?
Yeah, so we started over 6 years ago now, which tells you it's quite a slow-moving industry to enter. And the original idea was from really my dad, who is a concrete scientist. He is our head of R&D, and he was university professor for many years. And when I was a child, I would spend a lot of time with him in the lab. And that's when I learned about different materials and what they do and how they then magically turn into concrete, which is, I call domesticated rock.
Yeah,
we can do anything we want with it, right?
Yeah,
So you can, it can take any shape and form, and then so it really helped civilization to grow fast and connect land we couldn't connect, and build vertically versus horizontally and preserve land for farming. So amazing. So that's when I learned to love concrete and developed appreciation for that building material, and also learned the complexity of what goes into it to turn it into this amazing building material for us. And so my dad dedicated his life developing an additive that would improve the performance of cement, which is the main ingredient of concrete. And then it makes it stronger, more durable, a lot of different properties. And then when I ended up in New Zealand through a completely different career through KPMG, and I thought on the back of Christchurch earthquake, I thought New Zealand can benefit from more durable building material, more resilient building material. And that was the original idea. And then I met Matt Kennedy-Good, who is my co-founder and a business partner. And when we looked into it, he's like, oh, that's great. But when we looked into it, we found out that cement actually is a very carbon-intensive product. And if we are to solve something, that's probably a much bigger, challenging, and more urgent problem to solve, because there are other solutions that could improve performance of cement, but there's not many cement alternatives. And that's how Neocrete was born. 6 years ago, and then we developed it together. And now eventually we developed this additive that would convert a whole range of different materials into cement without having to build a big carbon intensive process and infrastructure.
That's great. Now, one thing that I was a little curious about is how long has concrete been around?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to go back to sort of hundreds, I think.
Thousands of years, really.
Yeah, like 600 BC, I saw a reference,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think that was, where was it?
The Roman concrete.
Yeah, but there was even something before that.
In Egypt.
And then the Romans sort of came in and they innovated and actually improved the technology. So I guess this is an area where humanity's been working for a really long time. So it's pretty cool to see now the kind of the next phase of that innovation happening.
So if we really simplify and connect our history to development of concrete, so 2,000 years ago we had this Roman concrete. So we needed, as humanity, something that would last long and will be very, very strong. So that's when they developed Roman concrete, which is pozzolanic concrete. So then 200 years ago, with Industrial Revolution and everything fast-paced and discovery of fossil fuels, just being strong and durable wasn't good enough. We needed to build fast. So Roman concrete is very good, but it takes months to set, right? But back then, we didn't care about that. So 200 years ago, everything fast-paced, we need to build. So then we're okay, we need to accelerate those chemical reactions. Let's heat it up. So then Portland cement, modern cement was invented. And then now, so we say fast forward to 2025, we now understand that, it's just being strong, durable, and fast is not good enough anymore, because we need to look after our planet. And if we keep doing what we're doing and releasing a lot of waste into the atmosphere or the land or the water, it's not probably a good thing. And now humanity is thinking, okay, it's not just good enough to build a great building material. We also need to build it in a sustainable, long-term way. And that's where the new wave of development of concrete is happening at the moment. And it's amazing to be part of that change and this building material.
Now, most startups seem to go through, pivots, often, numerous pivots. What's that look like on your journey with Neocrete?
Yes, we're no different to any other startup, and we had to pivot a lot. So originally we thought we're going to import something and then develop put R&D on top of it and then develop a product for New Zealand. Then with COVID and then the war happening and everything, we could not import anymore. And it forced us, we always wanted to innovate out of New Zealand and build something amazing New Zealand product, especially because New Zealand is rich of those minerals that we're using and materials that we're using. So that forced us to actually innovate much faster and build something locally, because we thought, we just build something and then we're going to use New Zealand materials. So we had to pivot and start developing a product here in New Zealand. And then our very, very first pre-seed investor construction company, they gave us a shipping container in Otahuhu. And then that was our first R&D lab. So we're just scouting all the materials in New Zealand and innovating. And then, so when we developed something and we started seeing good test results, we figured out that not only we can reduce, we thought we can partly replace cement, but with our developments, we figured out that we can completely, with a lot of, effort into it, but we can completely replace cement with these materials. And that was a big breakthrough moment. So in our toughest times, we found out something that we developed is actually not just New Zealand and Australia based, it's actually a global product and it doesn't have equivalent in the world. And so I had to.
That's pretty exciting. So what does that look like for the future of Neocrete in terms of, how do you go global?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's the reason why my co-founder couldn't be with us today, because in a couple of hours, he's jumping on a plane to London. So what it looks like is that we're going to expand into Europe. Most of our customers or potential customers are based there. It's a huge market. And there's a lot of pressure on replacing cement, regulatory pressure from carbon tax that was introduced recently. And that means that the price of cement is going to double in the next 5-6 years. That means that the cost of producing cement is going to go up and the cement manufacturers are now looking into alternatives.
Right. So
And-
this really is going to open a big door for Neocrete because you don't have those same sort of challenges. So in theory, your price point will actually drop below the price of traditional concrete.
Absolutely, because our way of production is very efficient. We only need to process an super active ingredient, our activator. We just couldn't come up with a better name.
Yeah.
And so that's only 2 to 3% of this volume of materials that you
Right.
highly process, process.
Yeah.
And then the rest of it has like really low processing costs and low processing like energy requirements, for example. And the best thing about our technology is that we can use existing cement infrastructure. So we don't need to rebuild the new infrastructure completely because it's a global product. If you can't scale fast, it's almost not very useful. And that's the reason why we've been selected by the Global Cement and Concrete Association in that innovation challenge. And we are one of 4 finalists to develop or like activate the materials from all over the world that the cement manufacturers already have access to. So here in the lab, we're currently in Parnell with very high parking costs. We actually do the testing of their materials at the moment, and then that will turn into pilots very soon. And the cement manufacturers really like our technology because it's one of the very few technologies that can scale fast, and it will reduce costs because the materials we're using don't need processing and they're lower cost and low carbon.
Yeah, that's really good. And you've had quite a bit of recognition in terms of, awards and nominations and so on. You're up for the NZ High Tech Awards as a finalist in the most innovative high tech solution from a sustainability standpoint. So yeah, lots going on that front. How hard was it to get investment? Because that's always the challenge for startups, and especially in the last few years, that hasn't necessarily been easy. But as a deep tech startup, is that maybe harder than for maybe a traditional kind of digital tech type startup?
Like, it was hard and then it wasn't. So just to elaborate on that is that, well, obviously we're quite a different startup to a lot of startups and deep tech startups, right? And then if you think about concrete industry, you don't really hear a lot of big breakthroughs in this, in this part of the world specifically. And so there are not many VCs who would exactly understand what we're doing and our vision. And we couldn't, when we're too early stage, we couldn't really explain our vision in a succinct way. So it was very hard. It's like having a VR glasses on, and you can see the beautiful picture inside, but no one else can. And then they see it completely different. So at the start, it was pretty hard. It took us a while to raise our seed round. And that's actually when the government grants like Callaghan Innovation that is disestablished, and like NZTA and Akina Foundation, that's when they're vital for Neocrete, because with their funding, we could actually get to the minimum viable product. We could protect our IP. We could turn our big fairy tale vision into a real company. And then we could understand what VCs are looking for. And then when we did raise, it was big success, because our seed round, we needed to increase the round a couple of times because there were way too many amazing investors who wanted to be part of Neocrete. So once we figured out how to,
So you got too much money.
Oh, it's never too much.
I know. I'm just kidding.
But yeah, I'm pretty happy.
Yeah, that's exciting. And you're based out of Parnell there with, I think, what used to be Level 2 is now Outset Ventures. So there's been some pretty well known startups, Rocket Lab and Holter and Lanzatech and so on that have, I guess, been through a journey with Outset. How has working with Outset helped?
It's amazing. We learned a lot from them. We can still ask any question we want, any difficult question, whether it's running a business or raising capital. It's a great environment. They're very supportive, very helpful. And I think once we moved to that building from that shipping container in Otahuhu, I think that's when we really turned into like this VC startup proper business.
Yeah.
And thanks to Mike and Matt and Angus from Outset, who were like babysitting us now and then. And we're actually, our very first lab in the building was a Rocket Lab first lab. So we're like, okay, we're on a good path, hopefully.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
And the whole community from other startups, we learn because some of them are ahead of us in the journey, and we're like, we ask and we share our frustrations with them too. So it's pretty cool community.
And so what can you share in terms of the funds that you've raised sort of to date?
So we raised in VCs, like seed round was $4 million US. It's public information. And then maybe another 1.5 in non-diluted government grants. And pre-seed was another maybe 350 US at the very, very start.
Yeah.
So, and we now have a team of 10. We've built a pilot plant, and we secured our first customer overseas. So we're no longer pre-revenue.
That's
Took
great.
us a while, but
Yeah.
so we sent our first shipping container of the activator to Brunei in Southeast Asia, and they managed to reduce their cement by 43% and reduce costs at the same time. So so that's a true testament of the effectiveness of our technology that can scale fast. So it took us maybe January to like 9 months to build a pilot plant, and we also didn't know what we were doing. So it's like kind of took us a while.
Yeah, so you'll speed up over time.
Yes, and we could deliver, do the trials, deliver to customer, do pilots, like big commercial scale trials, and do our first sales all within 1 year. And we think for a concrete company, it's actually pretty fast.
Yeah.
And also we can save costs to our customers, even though they're importing our activator all the way from New Zealand at a small scale. But their material that we're using to activate is very cheap. It's a waste product that they're trying to get rid of.
Great.
And that's perfect. So we recycle that material, and then we are reducing carbon emissions through not using that much cement.
Oh, very exciting. Now, for those that are interested in finding out more, they can obviously, look online, your website and so on. You don't sell direct to consumers, or even at this stage, I don't think you have a, New Zealand partner, so your product isn't quite available locally, but
Not yet.
you're obviously, working towards that. So that's really exciting. Anything else you'd like to add, Zarina?
Oh, I would just like to thank my team, because it's not just like, a CEO and founder success, it's the whole team. And I'm really happy with the team that we built together. And under this big umbrella of like the brand, I'd just like to thank my team and partner.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the New Zealand
Thank
Tech
you.
Podcast. Really interesting to hear the story, and all the best for the NZ High Tech Awards coming up. We must be roughly a couple of weeks out. All the best for that. And of course, a big thank you to our show partners, Gorilla Technology, HP, Spark, 2 Degrees, and 1NZ. Thanks everyone for listening in, and we'll look forward to catching you on the next episode. See ya.
The New Zealand Tech Podcast, brought to you by Gorilla Technology, proactive and strategic IT.